Today on Locked On Dolphins, we look at a couple of mock drafts across the space and specifically what the Dolphins did based on how the board broke for NFL.com, ESPN, and one bonus mock draft here today on Locked On Dolphins.
You are Locked On Dolphins, your daily Miami Dolphins podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right. Miami, welcome to another episode of Locked On Dolphins. It is your team every day here on the Locked On Network. I'm your host, Kyle Krabs, a lifelong Miami Dolphins fan, host of Locked On Dolphins, co-host of Locked On NFL Scouting. You can find our shows on YouTube or wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. Tip of the cap to our everydayers, because it is your team every day. We don't just say it. We live it here on the Locked On Network. Today's episode of Locked On Dolphins is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase on last-minute tickets. Lowest prices guaranteed. Today on the show, Lance Zierlein's one-round mock draft for NFL.com, Field Yates' two-round mock draft for ESPN.com, and a mystery mock draft that may or may not have been conducted by somebody that's on the show today. We'll get to that in segment 3. But the Lance Zierlein mock is the one that inspired me to do this show. I have Prospect Spotlight lined up for later today. We're going to do a doubleheader today, so you'll get the Prospect Spotlights as well. But this mock draft roundup being one that the way the board fell for Lance was a way that I have not seen mock draft boards fall yet. And it really made me sweat out as I'm scrolling through it, who was going to be on the board based on a couple of different dominoes that are just things that we as Dolphins fans, if we want as favorable of a board drop as we can actually get when the real draft comes around, we need to be mindful of. And Lance's mock is where we're going to start today. And just kind of going over some of the broad brush pictures before we get into the dominoes that impacted the board falling as unfavorably as it did for Miami. At 4 quarterbacks going the first 4 picks, Williams, Daniels, May, and McCarthy. The Giants trading up with the Patriots in this scenario. The Vikings trading up with the Cardinals. So 4 quarterbacks, and then you get wide receivers at 5 and 6 with Harrison Jr. and Neighbors. That's pretty chalk for what the expectation that we have going so far, as is Joe Alt at 7 to the Titans, and then Roma Dunze and Brock Bowers as 2 of the next 3 picks. Also kind of the expected norms of a lot of mock drafts that we're seeing right now. So top 10, I get through the top 10. I say, okay, like I'm a little surprised that the Falcons took Jared Verse. It's not really a lot of buzz for Verse going that early. I think Verse is the best edge rusher in the class personally. But it feels like the momentum in the media is in other places. So that surprised me a little bit. But that wasn't really where the domino started, because a lot of people expect Atlanta to be the first spot where a defensive player comes off the board. The domino tips with Arizona at 11. Arizona coming back in mock drafts in which Arizona stays at 4, they are getting a wide receiver. To come back to 11, they in turn draft Dallas Turner. And then the Broncos at 12 don't reach on the next quarterback. Many think Bo Nix is somebody who the Broncos have eyes for. And instead draft Quinyon Mitchell, the corner from Toledo. That spurt tips off this domino effect in which you get a really unfavorable run from 13 through 20 for Miami. We have 2 offensive tackles come off the board in Latham and Fashanu. Byron Murphy, the defensive tackle, goes to the Colts. The Cardinals projected to now trade up. They're a popular interior offensive line spot. The Cardinals then come up and get the wide receiver that many people are mocking them to get 11 in Brian Thomas Jr. Then you have Jacksonville taking a corner in Terrion Arnold. And now the real backbreaker stretch for Miami. Cincinnati now takes Troy Fautanu as the best offensive tackle on the board. The Rams take Laiatu Latu, the edge rusher from UCLA. And Pittsburgh takes Talise Fuaga, the offensive lineman from Oregon State. So that boom, boom, boom stretch based on the domino effect of what happened with Arizona getting a 3rd pick in the top half of the round, the failure of the Broncos to reach on a quarterback, and then the Raiders not having potentially Quinyon Mitchell. If the Broncos go with Bo Nix, The Raiders potentially go with Quinyon Mitchell. They have a need at corner as well. And then that would push J.C. Latham, and then one of the other offensive linemen is going to spill into Miami's lap, whether it's Fatanu or Fashanu or whoever else. So what Miami ends up getting in Lance's mock is Chop Robinson, the edge rusher from Penn State, who Lance himself says is raw but ridiculously explosive. And I think the explosiveness is very evident based on the athletic profile. I like Chop Robinson as a player, but at 21, would I be head over heels with the value of that selection? No. Based on the way the board fell here, kind of the clear and obvious best available player for me would be Johnny Newton from Illinois. And heaven forbid, Johnny Newton comes off the board in this stretch as well. Say Arizona comes up for Johnny Newton at 16 and everything else is exactly the same, I'd probably be getting out of this spot at all costs. I'd probably take a discount to get out of this spot. Feel like I get something to go with my appropriate value. Graham Barton's still on the board here. Amarius Mims, offensive tackle, still on the board. There's some wide receivers. But I'm looking at names like Darius Robinson, Graham Barton, Chop Robinson, ideally not at 21, though. So just a really nasty board break for Miami. And Johnny Newton's not in the first round of Lance's mock, which I think is notable. But there seems to be some apprehension with the foot injury that prevented him from testing at the combine. So that's something to watch for Newton as well as a potential bit of a slider. It seems like there's at least some smoke that may happen. But just based off of the tape of the players, I think for Miami at that spot at 21 with how the top 20 picks unfolded for you, courtesy of a couple domino effects and trades that really shook some stuff up in the teens, Johnny Newton would be the name on the card that I would be turning in. But Lance gave you Chop Robinson. Now we're going to talk about ESPN.com's mock for Field Yates up next here on this episode of Locked On Dolphins. So make sure that you stick with us. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime, the ticketing app that is completely committed to giving you the peace of mind of the best value and knowing exactly what you're getting with your tickets. Gametime is now an authorized ticket marketplace of Major League Baseball, which makes getting tickets even faster and easier. Prices on the Gametime app actually go down as it gets closer to the first pitch with killer last-minute deals, all-in prices viewed from your seat, and the lowest price guarantee. Gametime takes the guesswork out of buying tickets for Major League Baseball. Last-minute deals could save you up to 60% off when you buy last-minute seats for sports, concerts, comedy, theater, and more. And you can get your tickets directly to your phone in just a few taps. And the lowest price guarantee of Gametime gives you 110% credit for the difference if you find lower tickets in the same section and row. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDON, LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last-minute tickets, lowest prices, guaranteed. So the Field Yates mock came out today, I believe, and he had Miami sticking and picking at 21 and 55. And because there's two rounds, the focus is not so much on how the board unfolded to get to 21, but instead on the players that Miami ultimately is filling them with and how that fits within the Dolphins offseason as a whole. Miami's first pick in Field Yates' mock draft was Byron Murphy II, the defensive tackle from Texas, who we spotlighted yesterday and who went off the board at 15 in Lance Zierlein's mock earlier in the week. Here's what Field Yates had to say. The Dolphins just watched Christian Wilkins depart in free agency, but Murphy has some traces of Wilkins in his game as a disruptive interior defender. He had a great 2023 season with 5 sacks, but stats are far from the full story on his impact. He has a unique ability to torque and hold up against the run, and he makes life easier for players around him. And then at 55, the Dolphins go with the Robert Hunt replacement in Christian Haynes, the guard from the University of Connecticut. Commentary here, Dolphins lost Robert Hunt in free agency, opening a significant gap along the offensive line. Enter Haynes, an experienced guard who plays with a serious edge to his game. I think he'd be an ideal fit in Miami's offense. And I agree with Field in both fronts as players that are viable replacements for the players that have left Miami. And as you've kind of gotten more and more of a defined feel for what the Dolphins are doing this offseason, specifically with this latest move that just came through yesterday, which I'm going to tell you about in just a second, there is I guess, a Moneyball type element to these big decisions for Miami and letting these two big contracts walk. The Dolphins agreed to terms on a new one-year deal with Kendall Lamb yesterday, which I think is outstanding, right? Kendall Lamb played really well for 600 snaps for Miami this past season. The peace of mind that you have with a swing tackle that's a veteran. And I know Chris Kaufman from 3 Yards Per Carry made a great point on social media that if the Dolphins do draft a young offensive lineman, not charging with that player with having to cross-train and learn guard while being the backup tackle makes you feel really good about the outlook of that player, a la the Liam Eichenberg special. But now you've brought back Kendall Lamb, Isaiah Wynn, Robert Jones. You infuse Jack Driscoll into this mix. You swap out Aaron Brewer for Connor Williams as a player who's at the same price point instead of what is perceived to be an elevated price point before the injury for Connor Williams. And now you, in this mock draft, have Christian Haynes stepping in as an economic swap out of the same stylistic kind of player. Now, he's not as big or as long, and I don't think he has as much raw power, and he certainly doesn't have the tackle fluidity that Robert Hunt did, and that's why Robert Hunt got paid $20 million per season for the Carolina Panthers. But his best qualities are as a zone blocker, wide zone blocker specifically, in the run game and climbing to the second level and playing with an edge and chippiness that really stands out on tape. And I think that, in theory, for Miami is a part of the puzzle where you are potentially making some swaps of stylistic players that have parallels, but getting long-term, lower value deals as the alternative of giving your big money contracts to Christian Wilkins and Robert Hunt. So then on the defensive side of the ball to have Byron Murphy, who I generally agree has some parallels to Christian. He's a smaller player. He's not as sound or stout against the run. He's a little bit more of a penetrator as compared to a control player at the line of scrimmage, I think is what really stands out to me about Christian Wilkins. But I think he's got a higher ceiling as a pass rush, and his first step explosiveness and disruptiveness it's a very real quality of his game. And for Miami to come into or out of the draft and say, well, we have a lot of the same complementary pieces. We made some transitions elsewhere that are going to allow us to keep other players. And now we have a deeper roster because instead of paying Christian Wilkins and Robert Hunt, we're paying Aaron Brewer and Jonnu Smith and Jordan Brooks and Kendall Fuller and Jordan Poyer and Shaq Barrett and Anthony Walker and so on and so forth. So again, it's kind of the balance of the roster hanging. But the one thing the Dolphins have not done is they have not replaced either one of those two outgoing talents. And that is what you are hopeful that Miami will be able to have the opportunity to do. And they do that in Fields Mock. Now we got one more coming, and it's mine. Spoiler alert. So that's next here on this episode of Locked On Dolphins. So make sure that you stick with us. The sports calendar is absolutely loaded in April, and FanDuel's making it more exciting than ever to get in on the action. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 that you can use to bet on the tourney, Major League Baseball, NBA, NHL, and so much more. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to make your first bet a big win with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So I did my own mock. Spontaneously, I said, I got two. I got NFL.com and I got ESPN.com. I got like the two big national chain media type resources. But about the third segment, why don't we do one of our own? Obviously, we've started going through some prospects and wanted to have the opportunity to see how the board breaks. And there's a storyline that does unfold here that parallels one of the things that we talked about earlier. So I use Pro Football Network, and they just launched their multiplayer feature for their mock draft simulator, which is a very exciting development for them, and congratulations to them for doing so. But I did a single player mock in which I was responsible for the Miami Dolphins, and we did a 2-round mock draft. So you get into the simulator, you let it run, you get a feel for who's on the board when you pick, you get computer offered trades, you make a decision based off of that. So let's set the table and talk about how this board breaks versus how the board breaks for the Lance Zierlein mock, because there's something really interesting that ended up happening here. You had 4 quarterbacks in the top 11 picks: Williams, May, Daniels, McCarthy. And 11 is important because 11 is where Arizona traded back to in the Zierlein mock. And there were 4 quarterbacks there, and what Arizona did at 11 versus what they do at 4 has the domino effect. Well, sure enough, Arizona stays put in this simulator pick at 4 and drafts Marvin Harrison Jr. So then you go quarterback, wide receiver. The Giants now take Joe Alt instead of trading up for a quarterback. Olu Fashanu is now the domino effect at 7. Then you get Dallas Turner to the Falcons, Brock Bowers, Rome Odunze. Some combo of those feels like it's always 9 and 10 right now. And then Minnesota still gets J.J. McCarthy at 11. Arizona getting a wide receiver at 4. They do not trade up to 16 with Seattle, which means Seattle stays put. And that's where the domino effect really comes and helps you. Now, the Raiders take a right tackle still. The Broncos still take Quinyon Mitchell. The Saints take Talise Fuaga instead of Olu Fashanu, who's off the board at 7, because the Giants took Joe Alt at 6 because they didn't trade up with New England to get a quarterback. Domino effect, so on and so forth. Seattle, 16, Jackson Powers Johnson, a name that we've talked about in the deep dive, as well as not being in Lance Zierlein's mock draft. The Rams end up taking Chop Robinson because Jared Verse is off the board in addition to Dallas Turner, but Verse comes off at 17 versus at 8. Chop Robinson instead of Latu, who slides to 23 and is on the board when Miami comes on the board at 21 in my mock draft. And that is important context. I had Latu on the board. I also had Byron Murphy on the board. I had Graham Barton on the board. I had Johnny Newton on the board. I had several players that I felt really good about. And then you kind of read the room, and I get a trade offer from Detroit. And who's Detroit coming up for? It could be an interior defensive lineman, but they just had a big loss at corner. Philly, probably not an interior defensive line or an edge spot based on their roster and their needs. Dallas feels like a desperate offensive line spot, so you're mindful of that. But the tackles that I really wanted were off the board anyway, and it feels like anybody I'd be taking at this pick would be an interior guy. So I took Detroit's offer and moved back to 29. It's like I'm sitting here doing the math, and I'm reading the room, and I'm reading the board, and I felt like I had enough guys available with enough other teams that wouldn't be in contention for that, where I'd still be able to get one of those guys. And what I got in return was I got Detroit's 2nd-round pick. So now I go from 21 to 29, and I get 61 in the process as part of a pick swap. I send like a 5. So I send the 1 and the 5 and get a 1 and a 2 back. Feel really good about that value. At 29, sure enough, Johnny Newton's still on the board. That was the storyline from the Lance Zierlein mock, is Johnny Newton didn't go in the first round of Lance's mock. He ends up making it to 29 in this mock simulation situation. I take advantage of that, and Johnny Newton is now the pick, who would have been my pick in Lance Zierlein's situation, but Miami moves back, gets an extra 2nd-round pick in the process to cash in on. Now, coming around the 55, I knew the number one thing I would love to get is either a guard or a specific wide receiver. That, for me, would be Xavier Leggett from South Carolina. Kind of a pipe dream. Sure enough, Leggett comes off the board at 34 to New England in this mock draft simulation that I ran. And then Christian Haynes comes off the board to the Baltimore Ravens, who had moved up and jumped into the early 40s, which I think is a kind of a realistic projection for Haynes. I think one of the things that we're going to have to do after we do some of the prospect spotlights is not just say, hey, I really like these guys, but instead say, hey, realistically, here's how this board's probably going to break in the range that some of these guys are going to go. So just kind of calibrate your expectations accordingly. So, but I was glad that I went with an interior defensive lineman at 29 because you had a run on guys like Chris Jenkins, Leonard Taylor surprisingly came off the board. Tavondre Sweat came off the board all before Miami came back on the board at 55. So I would have been up, creek without a paddle at defensive tackle had I not got one in the first round in this specific simulation. But I was bummed I didn't get Xavier Leggett and Christian Haynes off the board as well. Those are kind of the two top targets that I would have. Who I ultimately ended up settling on is Roman Wilson, the wide receiver from Michigan. This is, of course, operating in the assumption that Tyler Boyd or Odell Beckham don't sign with the team between now and the draft. And I think that's a really good value for a player who has a kind of grittiness and toughness that you really like. He has an athletic profile that will translate to some separation. And as the third target, I think he's going to get a lot of favorable matchups to win some one-on-one situations. And he's got toughness over the middle, and he blocks his rear end off, even if he's not the biggest guy. Would I love a different body type in the wide receiver room? Yeah, absolutely. But it didn't break that way, and I wasn't going to reach on a big-bodied wide receiver just to draft a big-bodied wide receiver versus taking one that I think could actually play in the scheme. But remember, I also have 61, courtesy of the trade back to 29. And with that pick, I end up drafting a defensive player in the secondary, Javon Bullard, who's not a player that we have talked about at this stage. But there was not a lot of interior offensive line help that I really liked at that stage. I think there's some veterans that are out there that Miami can ultimately kick the tires on, whether that is a Dalton Risner, who everyone has been asking for the Dolphins to sign for 2 years, it feels like, whether that is a Laken Tomlinson. There's some economic options with guys that have starting experience that Miami can go to that well. But again, I'd rather not reach on the next guard and just to be able to say, well, I drafted McCormick from South Dakota State to make sure that I drafted a guard. I've watched a little bit of him, and while the athletic profile is really, really attractive, I think that that's a more raw player than Mason McCormick from South Dakota State. Would not feel really good about that player stepping into a starting role for the Dolphins in year one. And if we can avoid the offensive line player development, I would rather do that and then draft a player who I just think is an outstanding value and a baller in Javon Bullard, who will be a part of one of our next prospect spotlights. So you have that to look forward to learn a little bit more about Javon Bullard. But that's going to do it for this episode of Locked On Dolphins. So Lance Zierlein has the Dolphins taking Chop Robinson at 21 in a near full disaster, catastrophic, worst case scenario board break for Miami. The Field Yates ESPN mock has the Dolphins drafting replacements for both Christian Wilkins and Robert Hunt with Byron Murphy II and Christian Haynes. I would be very pleased with that duo for the Dolphins. And then my mock draft, of course, has the trade back to 29, courtesy of the computer offer trade from the Pro Football Network mock draft simulator, drafting Johnny Newton, wide receiver, Roman Wilson at 55, and then getting Javon Bullard, kind of your third safety, another versatile, movable piece in the secondary that really locks in your safety room with somebody who can do a lot of things and tackle very well and has some explosive range and can play in the slot a little bit. So that is my simulation based on the way the board felt. And I think that's always important, when you do these mock drafts, to be able to say, look, this is what I had available to choose from. Because I could just cherry pick names all I want and say, well, we're going to take Jared Verse at 21, and then we're going to take either Johnny Newton or Christian Haynes or Xavier Leggett at 55. But in reality, the numbers do work against you. There's a lot of teams that feel that way about Xavier Leggett and want to get him after the first 25 picks or so. So that's what I came up with based on the board and the way that it broke. Hope you guys enjoyed. walk through a couple of mock drafts, including my own spur of the moment 2-round mock with a trade. That is going to do it for this episode of Locked On Dolphins. You can keep it locked in right here on Locked On Dolphins. It is your team every day. Make it a great rest of your day. I'll be back again later today with a prospect spotlight coming your way for 3 players and how they may fit the Dolphins in the 2024 NFL Draft. Hope to see you then. Fins up.